It is the autumn of 1942, and the North African desert is a cauldron of competing armies, shifting front lines, and desperate improvisation. Rommel's Africa Corps has pushed deep into Egypt. The British Eighth Army is regrouping, rearming, and searching for any advantage it can find. Intelligence is everything. And somewhere behind enemy lines, a British officer in a German uniform is about to do something so audacious, so breathtakingly cool-headed, that even the men who ordered it could scarcely believe it when they heard what had happened. His name was Captain John Haselden, and on the night of 13 September 1942, dressed in the field grey uniform of a German officer, he walked through the front doors of an Axis headquarters building, returned the salute of the sentry at the door, and proceeded to spend the better part of an hour inside, gathering intelligence that would change the shape of the war in North Africa. Imagine for a moment what that takes. You are surrounded by the enemy. Every man in that building has been trained to be suspicious. The wrong word, a mispronounced phrase, a uniform button worn incorrectly. Any of these could mean death. And yet Captain Haselden walked in as though he owned the place. He saluted. He was saluted back. And then he walked out again. One survivor, who heard the account firsthand, described it simply as the most remarkable thing I have ever been told. It is a story that has been whispered in military circles for decades, buried in the archives of special operations and long-range desert group records, and yet it has never quite received the attention it deserves. Because what Haselden brought out of that building, and what happened as a direct result of what he learned, would shape one of the most daring commando raids of the entire Second World War. To understand why any of this was necessary, you have to understand the peculiar hell that was the North African campaign in 1942. By the middle of that year, things were going very badly indeed for the Allies. Rommel, the Desert Fox, as his enemies had come to call him with a mixture of grudging admiration and genuine fear, had driven the British back across Libya and into Egypt itself. Tobruk had fallen in June, a humiliation so profound that Winston Churchill was in Washington when he heard the news, and described it as one of the heaviest blows he suffered during the entire war. The problem was not simply military, it was logistical. Rommel's armies depended on supply lines that stretched across the Mediterranean from Italy, and those supply lines converged on a handful of critical ports. The most important of these, the one that made the entire Axis operation in North Africa possible, was Tobruk itself. Once the Germans held it, they had a deep-water harbour capable of landing thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and equipment every single week. Without Tobruk, Rommel's army could not advance. With it, his forces seemed unstoppable. British planners in Cairo knew this. They knew that if Tobruk could be neutralized, if its fuel dumps could be destroyed, its harbour facilities wrecked, and its garrison thrown into chaos, then Rommel's momentum might be broken before the decisive battle that everyone knew was coming. What they needed was intelligence, precise, detailed, actionable intelligence about the layout of the defences, the location of the fuel stores, the patterns of the guards, the positions of the anti-aircraft batteries. And there was only one man the planners trusted to get it. John Haselden was, in many respects, the perfect man for this kind of work. Born in Egypt to an English father and an Egyptian mother, he had grown up speaking Arabic fluently, understood the rhythms and customs of North African life, and had spent years before the war working in the region as a cotton merchant. When the war came, he joined the Long-Range Desert Group, the LRDG, a unit whose entire purpose was to operate deep behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and striking at targets that conventional forces could not reach. The LRDG had already accomplished extraordinary things by the time Haselden was given his assignment. Small patrols of 5 or 6 men, driving stripped-down lorries fitted with extra fuel tanks and heavy machine guns, had crossed hundreds of miles of open desert to report on Axis movements, rescue downed airmen, and guide other special forces units to their targets. They had learned, through hard experience, that the desert itself was a kind of armor, that if you went far enough into the emptiness, you became invisible to the enemy, because no sensible person was supposed to be there at all. Haselden had used this principle to devastating effect. On previous operations, he had disguised himself as an Arab, as a civilian, and on at least one occasion, according to accounts that were still being pieced together from regimental histories well after the war. As a German officer, he had an extraordinary facility for languages, a calm that experienced soldiers found almost uncanny, and a quality that is very difficult to teach: the ability to behave under extreme pressure, exactly as you would behave if there were no pressure at all. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps this kind of history coming to the surface where it belongs. The operation that would become known as Operation Agreement began to take shape in the late summer of 1942. The overall plan was extraordinarily ambitious. Some would say recklessly so. A naval force would approach Tobruk from the sea. Commandos would attack from the landward side. The RAF would bomb the harbour facilities, and Haselden's small team, fewer than a dozen men, would infiltrate the town beforehand, dressed as German guards escorting British prisoners of war, to open the gates for the main force from the inside. It was in the preparation for this operation that Haselden's remarkable solo reconnaissance mission took place. Travelling in advance of his team, alone, in a German uniform, he made his way into the Tobruk garrison area. The details of exactly how he moved through the checkpoints remain, in some respects, unclear. The operational files are not complete, and Haselden himself would not survive the operation to give a full account. But the outline is not in dispute. He entered an Axis command facility. He observed. He gathered the information his planners needed, and he left. The sheer nerve of it is difficult to overstate. German and Italian security procedures in 1942 were, by any reasonable standard, thorough. Passes were checked. Credentials were verified. Officers who were not known to the garrison were regarded with suspicion. And yet accounts from survivors of Haselden's unit, recorded in the weeks after the operation, describe a man who moved through this environment with complete composure, who saluted, was saluted in return, nodded at sentries, and walked out with what one officer later described as everything we needed to know. What he brought back included the precise locations of fuel dumps, vast stores of petrol and diesel that kept Rommel's armour moving across the desert. He identified the disposition of the garrison forces, the location of heavy artillery, and critically, the positions of anti-aircraft guns that would be lethal to any naval landing force approaching from the sea. This was not vague, impressionistic intelligence. This was the kind of detailed, accurate information that could only have been gathered by someone who had been inside. Compare for a moment what British intelligence had available before Haselden's mission, and what German intelligence was managing to achieve at the same time. Axis humaned. Human intelligence gathered through agents and infiltrators in the British rear areas was, by mid-1942, a persistent and serious problem. The Germans had successfully run agents into Cairo and Alexandria, and had benefited from what became known in Allied intelligence circles as the good source. A leak from the American military attaché's office that had for months been providing Rommel with detailed reports on British strength and dispositions. British intelligence, by contrast, found it far harder to penetrate Axis-held territory. The language barrier was significant. Arabic was widely spoken, but German fluency of the quality Haselden possessed was rare. The physical environment of the garrison towns, enclosed, heavily guarded, full of men who knew each other by sight, was deeply hostile to infiltration. What Haselden accomplished was not simply unusual. It was, in operational terms, something approaching unique. Operation Agreement launched on the night of 13 to 14 September 1942. Haselden's team crossed the wire on schedule, moving into Tobruk disguised as their own prisoners. The initial stages of the operation went largely according to plan. Haselden's men secured their objectives within the town, captured a coastal gun battery, and waited for the naval force to arrive. But Operation Agreement as a whole was a catastrophe. The naval force ran into a wall of fire from shore batteries that were far better prepared than planners had hoped. HMS Sikh and HMS Zulu, two destroyers carrying the main commando force, were sunk with enormous loss of life. The landing force that did get ashore found itself heavily outnumbered and without the support it had been promised. By morning, the operation had failed at a cost of several hundred British and Commonwealth lives, plus the crews of two destroyers and a substantial number of aircraft. John Haselden was killed during the fighting in Tobruk, shot during the close quarters battle that followed the collapse of the wider operation. He was 40 years old. He was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously, the citation noting, with the characteristic British understatement of such documents, that he had displayed outstanding gallantry and devotion to duty. The failure of Operation Agreement has tended to overshadow the extraordinary individual achievement that preceded it, and that is, in some ways, understandable. When an operation ends in disaster, it is difficult to look clearly at the elements within it that worked. But to do so is to miss something important. Haselden's solo reconnaissance demonstrated in the most practical possible terms what a single trained, determined, linguistically gifted individual could accomplish in an environment where he had absolutely no right to be. The intelligence he gathered was accurate. It was actionable. The operation that used it failed not because the intelligence was wrong, but because the larger military machinery around it was not equal to the task. That is a very different kind of failure. And it matters because it points toward what might have been possible under different circumstances. The legacy of Haselden's methods would echo through the remainder of the war and well beyond it. The long-range desert group's techniques of deep infiltration, of using disguise, and local knowledge to move through hostile territory were studied carefully by planners in London and Washington. The principle that a single individual, properly prepared, could gather intelligence that no aerial photograph or signals intercept could provide, that the human element was irreplaceable, would become a foundational assumption of Allied special operations. The Special Air Service, founded by David Stirling in 1941 and operating in close partnership with the LRDG, drew directly on the lessons of operations like the one Haselden conducted. So did the Office of Strategic Services, the American forerunner of the CIA, which was, in 1942, still learning how to run agents in hostile territory and paid close attention to what the British had developed in the desert. The records, the debriefs, the after-action reports that survived the chaos of the failed operation were studied and restudied in the months that followed. There is a particular kind of bravery that is, in some ways, harder to appreciate than the bravery of the battlefield. The man charging a machine gun nest is visible, his courage immediate and unmistakable. The man who walks calmly into an enemy headquarters maintains absolute composure while surrounded by men who would kill him if they knew who he was, gathers his intelligence and walks out again. His bravery is almost entirely invisible. It leaves no trace except in the operational files, and often not even there. Haselden's Victoria Cross acknowledged his fighting courage in the final hours of his life. But there is an argument, made quietly by some historians of the special operations world, that his greater achievement was the one that happened before the shooting started, the walk into German headquarters, the salute returned, the hour spent inside, the walk out. Think about that for a moment. Surrounded by the enemy, every step watched, every word potentially fatal. And he walked, not ran, not crept, not scrambled. He walked, as if he had every right to be there, as if the uniform he wore was his own. The information he carried out of that building was put to use in an operation that ultimately did not succeed. The harbour of Tobruk remained in Axis hands. The fuel dumps continued to supply Rommel's armour. But 6 weeks after the failed raid at a place called El Alamein, the battle that would finally break Rommel's advance began. The Desert Fox, outnumbered and short of fuel, was pushed back and kept going back all the way to Tunisia, to defeat and to surrender. History does not always distribute its credit fairly. The dramatic battles get the monuments and the films. The solitary figures who walked alone into the dark, who gathered the threads that others wove into victory, tend to disappear into the footnotes. John Haselden's story is a footnote in the official histories. A decorated officer, killed in a failed raid, mentioned in dispatches, and then largely forgotten by everyone except the small community of special operations historians who keep faith with such things. But the man walked into German headquarters. He returned their salute. And for one extraordinary hour in the autumn of 1942, the most dangerous man in North Africa was the one they thought was one of their own. That is not a footnote. That is a story.